Have you ever heard the old saying, pride comes before the fall? In everyday life, it's a gentle reminder to stay humble. But on the battlefield, it's a brutal law of physics written in blood and steel. And our story begins with that very pride, an almost absolute certainty in a plan that was believed to be perfect. Let's set the scene. It's June 2025. The war in Ukraine has entered a grinding, exhausting phase. The front lines seem frozen, and both sides are desperate for a breakthrough, something that can shatter the stalemate. For the Russian high command, the pressure to deliver a decisive victory is immense. They need something spectacular, not just to gain a military advantage, but to boost morale back home and send a powerful message to the West. And so a daring plan was born in the quiet wood-paneled briefing rooms of the Kremlin. This wasn't going to be another frontal assault with tanks rolling across the fields of the Donbass. No, this was far more elegant. This plan was a stealthy dagger aimed directly at a critical vulnerability in Ukraine's southern flank. The core idea was a covert amphibious landing. 6 military ferries specially modified to minimize their radar and acoustic signatures would slip out of Crimea under the cover of total darkness. They weren't just carrying soldiers. This was a miniature expeditionary force, a mailed fist designed for lightning-fast strikes over 380 battle-hardened Marines, from the elite 810th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, 24 nimble BTR, -82 amperes armored, personnel carriers, and tons of ammunition and artillery shells. Their mission sounded simple, but was incredibly ambitious: land at a remote river mouth, about 75 miles from the strategic city of Mykolaiv. This location wasn't chosen at random. Russian military intelligence, the GRU, had spent months analyzing satellite data, reconnaissance reports, and Ukrainian radar patterns. They were convinced they had found the perfect gap in their enemy's defenses. A radar blind spot, a place where NATO spy satellites rarely passed at night, and an area Ukrainian patrols often overlooked. To them, it was as safe as their own backyard. The operational plan was detailed down to the minute. They would depart just after midnight, maintaining a steady speed to avoid creating a large wake that could be detected. A strict radio silence would be enforced. Navigators would rely on celestial navigation and military-grade encrypted GPS. The goal was to be ashore before the first light of dawn, establish a solid beachhead, and by 6:00 a.m., the armored column would begin its push inland, striking the rear of the Ukrainian units defending Mykolaiv. If it worked, it would create mass panic, sever supply lines, and force a Ukrainian retreat along the entire southern front. In the minds of the Russian strategists, this wasn't just a good plan. It was a masterpiece of military art. They had accounted for every variable from the weather and the tides to the orbital schedules of spy satellites. They were confident they were executing the perfect infiltration, a ghost operation their enemy would only realize was happening when it was far too late. That confidence permeated the chain of command. They didn't just think they would succeed, they believed they couldn't fail. And so, on a late June night, as the Black Sea lay like a sheet of ink, the 6 Phantoms began their journey. The soldiers on board, silent and resolute, had no idea they weren't the hunters in the night. They were the prey willingly walking into a perfectly laid trap. The perfect gamble was on the table, and the wheel of fate had begun to spin. But it wasn't going to stop where they expected. While Russia's 6 ferries sailed on in a bubble of self-assured silence, a completely different story was unfolding on the Ukrainian side. This story didn't begin with the roar of engines or the clang of steel. It began with patience, innovation, and a philosophy of war that had been reshaped by sheer necessity. To understand what was about to happen, you need to understand General Anatoly Vashchenko, commander of the Southern Operations Group. Vashchenko wasn't an old-school general who believed in conventional battles fought with tanks and artillery. He belonged to a new breed of Ukrainian military leader, one who had learned the hard lessons of the war's early years. The biggest lesson was this: when you face an enemy that outnumbers you in men and machines, you cannot win by playing their game. You have to change the game itself. Vashchenko's philosophy was simple: information is ammunition, time is an ally, and patience is the killing blow. He believed that knowing where the enemy was and what he was going to do was more important than having more tanks. For months, he and his staff had been obsessed with the very same radar blind spot the Russians were so confident in. He knew it was a vulnerability, a potential avenue for a surprise attack. But instead of trying to plug that gap with expensive and easily targeted radar systems, he chose a different, smarter approach. His solution was a humble-looking piece of equipment, the PD-2 reconnaissance UAV. On its own, the PD-2 isn't revolutionary tech. It's a reliable surveillance drone. But under Vashchenko's command, the PD-2 seconds in his sector were transformed. They weren't just eyes in the sky, they were intelligence assassins. Ukrainian engineers had worked tirelessly to upgrade them. They were given a special airframe coating that absorbed radar signals, making them nearly invisible to Russian air defenses. More importantly, their infrared sensors were modified, boosting their sensitivity and range. But the most critical upgrade was in their software and data links. Each drone was programmed to loiter for hours at an optimal altitude, often between atmospheric thermal layers where the temperature differences make ground-based thermal detection incredibly difficult. They didn't circle constantly. They could hang in the air almost motionless like a hunting hawk, and they didn't transmit a continuous stream of data which could be tracked. Instead, they sent out heavily encrypted data packets in short, randomized bursts, lasting only milliseconds. To Russian electronic warfare systems, these signals looked like nothing more than atmospheric static. On that fateful night, one of these silent hawks was on station hovering at 6,000 meters. It wasn't looking for anything in particular. Its job was simply to watch and report any anomaly. And then, at 3:15 a.m., the anomaly appeared. 6 warm spots moving in a perfect tight formation materialized on the operator's screen. They didn't look like fishing trawlers or merchant ships. They were moving with too much discipline, and their heat signatures were consistent with powerful diesel engines under load. The analysis software immediately flagged them as potential military targets. The UAV did nothing. It didn't change altitude, didn't emit any detectable signal. It just kept watching. Every 10 seconds, a new data packet was sent. The thermal images grew clearer, revealing not just the shapes of the ferries, but the smaller heat blobs on their decks, the armored vehicles, and the hundreds of soldiers. In General Vashchenko's command bunker, a silent alert flashed on the strategic display. The data stream from the silent eye in the sky was being piped directly to his table. There was no panic, no rush, just a quiet, intense focus. Vashchenko's greatest fear was being realized. The enemy was coming through the back door. But with that danger came an opportunity. The enemy had no idea they'd been seen. They were still moving in darkness, but to the Ukrainians, they were lit up as brightly as if it were noon. The game had changed, and now Vashchenko was holding all the cards. As the crisp thermal images of the 6 Russian ferries glowed on the main screen, the air in General Vashchenko's command bunker grew thick with tension. For any other officer, the instinctive reaction would have been to order an immediate attack. The enemy was on the water, vulnerable, concentrated. A few volleys of anti-ship missiles could do significant damage. But Vashchenko saw a bigger picture. He didn't want to just damage them. He wanted to annihilate them. He knew that a premature attack, even a partially successful one, would alert the surviving ferries. They would scatter, report the ambush, and his most precious weapon, the element of surprise, would be gone forever. Hold your fire. Maintain positions. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of command. Track them. Vashchenko's decision wasn't hesitation. It was cold, hard calculation, a move in a deadly chess game. He was letting his prey walk deeper into the trap. And that trap wasn't just a random spot on the map, it was a masterpiece of leveraging terrain physics and psychology. He pointed to a location on the digital map, a narrow section of the river mouth, about a 20-minute journey from the convoy's current position. The area was flanked by steep banks and soft, marshy wetlands. To the Russians, this was an ideal approach. The banks would shield them from low-level land-based radar. But to Vashchenko, it had another far more important characteristic. It was a natural acoustic shadow. Imagine you're in a deep canyon. Sound from the outside is muffled, and any noise you make echoes inside. This river channel worked on the same principle. The steep banks and dense vegetation would absorb and deflect sound coming from the outside. A missile screaming in from the land would be almost completely silent until the final terrifying seconds. Conversely, the roar of the 6 ferries' diesel engines would be trapped within the channel, making it impossible for any soldier on board to use sound to get their bearings. In essence, Vashchenko had chosen a place where his enemy would be rendered deaf and blind in the most critical moments. Now the question was how to kill them. Vashchenko had no fighter jets or warships available, but he had something better. A carefully chosen trio of weapon systems, each with a specific role to play in the symphony of destruction he was about to conduct. Instrument 1-3 Berevy MLRS launchers. These are not high-tech weapons. The Buravy is a multiple-launch rocket system, basically a giant battlefield shotgun that fires a barrage of 8,220mm rockets in a short span. Its goal isn't pinpoint accuracy. Its goal is to create a saturation zone of fire and shrapnel over a wide area. Vashchenko would use these first not to sink the ferries, but to sow chaos, kill soldiers on the exposed decks, destroy communications and air defense systems, and force the convoy to break formation in a panic. It was the psychological blow, the stunning opening act. Instrument 2-1 Ram-2, loitering munition. If the Buravy was the sledgehammer, the Ram-2 was the surgeon's scalpel. This is a smart kamikaze drone. It can circle over a target area for an extended period, allowing its operator to identify the most critical target. Vashchenko gave it one job: aim for the bridge of the lead command ferry. By taking out the command and control hub at the very beginning, he would decapitate the snake, leaving the other ferries leaderless and disoriented in the middle of a firestorm. Instrument 3. The Finisher 2R-360 Neptune cruise missiles. These are the true ship hunters. Designed to fly extremely low over the water just feet above the waves, they are almost invisible to radar until it's too late. Vashchenko had them upgraded with new active seekers, allowing them to lock onto the largest heat and metal signatures. Their targets weren't just any ferries. One would aim for the secondary command vessel, there's always a backup, and the other would aim for a target. His intelligence analysts had identified one of the ferries had been converted to carry reserve fuel. Hitting it wouldn't just cause an explosion. It would create a massive, expanding fireball, turning the entire waterway into a floating inferno. In the 7 short minutes it took for the Russian convoy to steam towards the trap, an invisible command network operated at lightning speed. Target coordinates were relayed to the Buravy launchers hidden in a wheat field. The Ram-2 was launched and began circling at its loiter altitude awaiting the command. The Neptune missiles were powered up in their launchers. Everything was ready. The trap was set. The bait was swimming right into it. All that was left was to wait for the perfect moment to spring it. Time seemed to slow down. On the screens in General Vashchenko's bunker, 6 orange heat signatures. The 6 Russian ferries crept steadily into the red-bordered area marked Kill Zone. The silence in the room was almost physical. Every officer, every analyst held their breath. They had done everything they could. They had planned, they had prepared, and now the fate of over 380 lives and the momentum of the entire Southern Front rested on the next few minutes. Try to put yourself on the deck of the lead Russian ferry at 4:42 a.m. The air is cold and damp with sea spray. The thrum of the diesel engines is a steady, almost hypnotic drone. It's almost completely dark, save for the silver glint of moonlight on the waves. You're tired from hours of transit, but you're also wired, filled with adrenaline and anticipation. You believe in your mission. You believe in your officers. You believe in the perfection of the plan. You're less than an hour from the Ukrainian coast. In your mind, you see a successful landing, a swift victory. You feel like you're part of something great, a stealthy spear point about to pierce the enemy's heart. You have no idea you are exactly 17 seconds away from annihilation. High above at 5,000 meters, the operator of the Ram-2 saw a very different picture through his thermal camera. 6 targets, perfectly aligned, spaced exactly 40 meters apart. He had his target lock the boxy shape of the bridge on the lead ferry. His thumb hovered over the activation button. He felt no hatred, just the cold focus of a hunter waiting for the signal. In a wheat field 22 miles away, the crews of the 3 Buravy launchers had finished inputting the final coordinates. The steel doors of the launchers were open, revealing rows of rockets ready to roar to life. They couldn't see the target. They trusted the numbers on their screens. And in the command bunker, Vashchenko stared at the countdown clock. He waited until the very last ferry was fully inside the acoustic shadow. No one could be allowed to escape. No warning could be allowed to get out. 4:42 and 13 seconds. The clock hit 0. Execute. Vashchenko's voice cut through the silence. It was a single word, but it triggered a lethal chain reaction. Second 1, Ampere sound, like tearing fabric ripped through the night, as 240 Thunder 220mm rockets launched from the wheat field in a near-simultaneous volley. They arced into the night sky like a swarm of fiery hornets, tracing brilliant lines before plunging towards their target. Second 10. The first steel rain hit. The Russian soldiers on deck didn't even have time to look up. The water around them erupted into 1,000 geysers of water and shrapnel. The shriek of tearing metal, the screams of the wounded, and the crack of secondary explosions from ammunition crates being hit all blended into one deafening roar. Absolute chaos descended. The convoy instantly lost all cohesion. Second 13. While the chaos was at its peak, the Ram 2 began its terminal dive. It plunged at a near vertical angle, accelerating to over 300 miles per hour. Coming from directly above, no radar system on the ferries, if any were still working, could have tracked it. Second 16. The Ram 2's 4 kilograms tandem warhead slammed through the glass and steel of the command ferry's bridge. A half-second later, it detonated. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was perfectly placed. The entire command staff for the landing operation was vaporized in an instant. A secondary blast erupted as electronics were destroyed, turning the bridge into a fireball. The lead ferry now, without a pilot, began to turn aimlessly in a circle. Second 17. As the remaining ferries reeled from the first 2 strikes, 2 thin streaks of light appeared, skimming just feet above the water from the east. The 2 Neptune missiles. They were too low too fast. There was no time to react. Their seekers were locked. One missile struck the second command vessel dead center where the communications hub was located. It tore the ship in half. The second missile, as programmed, slammed into the fuel-carrying ferry. And that's when hell truly opened up. A deafening blast, louder than all the others combined. A massive orange fireball erupted into the sky, momentarily turning night into day. Thousands of gallons of diesel fuel ignited, spreading across the water, creating a lake of fire. Soldiers who jumped overboard to escape the sinking ships were consumed by the flames. In under 150 seconds from Vashenko's command to the final explosion, it was over. Where a proud naval formation had been, there was now only a field of burning wreckage oil slicks and the sounds of screams fading into silence. The trap had been sprung with perfect, brutal efficiency. As the last flames on the water sputtered out, returning the darkness to the Black Sea, an eerie silence settled over the scene. It was the silence of death. The water, which moments before had churned with explosions and screams, was now still dotted with charred debris and the iridescent sheen of oil slicks under the starlight. The 6 ferries were gone, having taken over 300 lives and dozens of war machines with them to their cold, watery graves. But the battle wasn't over. It had just moved to a different front, one with no gunfire and no smoke, but one that was no less brutal, the information front. At 4:47 a.m., Russian reconnaissance satellites passed over the area on their scheduled orbits. They saw nothing out of the ordinary. No landing fleet, no signs of a major naval battle. Just a few lingering hotspots that could easily be dismissed as natural fires or onshore industrial activity. To the analysts in Moscow looking at those images, the landing fleet had simply vanished into thin air. The signals from the 6 ships had gone dark on all tracking systems around 3:30 a.m. But at first, this was attributed to their strict adherence to radio silence. As dawn broke, however, and still no report came from the landing force, that silence began to feel ominous. Concern slowly turned to alarm and then to a quiet, controlled panic at the highest levels of command. At GRU headquarters, officers frantically tried to reach the fleet on backup encrypted channels. There was no response. Reconnaissance planes were secretly dispatched to the area, only to report back sightings of unidentifiable wreckage. The Kremlin was facing a nightmare. An elite, fully equipped force had disappeared without a trace. Failure was one thing, but a mysterious, inexplicable failure was something else entirely. It implied a terrifying level of impotence. And so they did what authoritarian regimes do when faced with an inconvenient truth: they buried it. No official announcement was made. The Russian Ministry of Defense's evening bulletin made no mention of any landing operation. Instead, they focused on positive news: a successful military exercise in the Arctic, the launch of a new submarine. State media, like a well-oiled machine, pivoted in unison, directing the public's attention anywhere but the Black Sea. This silence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it prevented panic and awkward questions at home. It hid the scale of the disaster from their own people. But on the other hand, it was a wordless confession to the rest of the world. Western intelligence agencies, through intercepted communications and human intelligence sources, were already piecing together what had happened. Russia's silence only confirmed it. A leaked recording, allegedly a conversation between two high-ranking FSB officers, spread like wildfire on anti-Kremlin channels. In it, a worried voice says, "The convoy is gone. We have no black box, no witnesses, nothing. It's like they were waiting for us." That single sentence revealed their deepest fear. This wasn't an accident or a stroke of bad luck. This was a perfectly planned ambush. Their enemy wasn't just stronger, they were smarter. They knew the plan, the route, the timing. This raised an even more terrifying question. How was there a high-level traitor? Or were Ukraine's intelligence capabilities far beyond anything they had imagined? Meanwhile, the Ukrainian side chose a strategy of stark contrast. They didn't need to brag or exaggerate. The truth was powerful enough. At noon, General Vashchenko appeared briefly before the cameras. He offered no operational details. He just delivered a single ice-cold line. When invaders come by sea, they should be prepared to drown. The world heard it loud and clear. That statement, paired with the silence from Moscow, painted the complete picture. Military analysts at the Pentagon and NATO hailed it as a textbook case of low-cost denial warfare, the ability to neutralize an expensive enemy force with far cheaper means. The European media gave it a memorable name, the Blind Bay Massacre. Worse for the Kremlin, the consequences of the silence were also deeply personal. Hundreds of families would never receive official word about their loved ones. Their sons, husbands, and fathers would simply be listed as missing in action. No funerals, no coffins, just a silent void and the state's empty platitudes. The silence was no longer a shield. It had become a festering wound, a betrayal of the very soldiers they had sent to their deaths. The massacre in the Black Sea was more than just a single event. It was like a massive stone dropped into a still pond, sending out ripples that washed across the globe, shaking the very foundations of modern military thought. Its impact went far beyond the 320 casualties, or the $120 million of lost equipment. It forced strategists from Washington to Beijing to sit up and ask fundamental questions about the nature of warfare in the 21st century. The first and most immediate ripple was the shift in perception of the Ukrainian military. Before this, many in the West still viewed Ukraine's successes primarily through the lens of bravery and foreign-supplied weapons. But this ambush was different. It was conducted almost entirely with homegrown or heavily modified systems, and more importantly, it was orchestrated by Ukrainian tactical genius. It proved that Ukraine wasn't just defending, it was innovating. It had become a real-time laboratory for warfare, where new doctrines were being tested and old technologies were being reborn with new purpose. The Pentagon began studying the operation as a case study in successful asymmetric warfare. European military academies incorporated it into their curriculum. The message was clear. This wasn't a story of David and Goliath, where David got lucky with a single stone. This was a story of David spending months studying Goliath's anatomy, calculating wind velocity, and engineering a high-precision slingshot. The second ripple was the brutal exposure of weaknesses in Russian military doctrine. Their landing plan, while detailed, was based on an outdated assumption that physical stealth, avoiding radar, maintaining radio silence, was enough to guarantee surprise. They had failed to account for an enemy that could see them in the thermal spectrum, an enemy that could process data and make decisions at lightning speed. The attack laid bare a crippling rigidity in the Russian command structure. They were too dependent on the initial plan and lacked the flexibility to adapt when things went wrong. The failure to detect the PD-2 UAV wasn't just a technological failure. It was a failure of imagination. They were looking for familiar threats, fighter jets, warships, large radar installations, and completely missed the tiny, cheap threat hovering right above their heads. It pointed to a dangerous lack of strategic creativity, a fatal disease for any army. The third and perhaps most significant ripple was about the economics of war. Just look at the numbers. Ukraine's cost for the ambush, a 1 PD-2 UAV, approx. $30,000. 3 salvos from older Burevy systems, estimated under $500,000. 1 Ram-2 loitering munition approx. $100,000. 2 Neptune missiles approx. $1,000,000. Total estimated cost under $2 million. Russia's losses, 6. Military ferries, 24 BTR, -82 amperes vehicles, and tons of munitions, over $120 million. the loss of over 300 elite trained soldiers, a cost that can't be measured in dollars. O. A strategic delay across the entire southern front, an invaluable loss. The cost-benefit ratio is staggering over 6-0 to 1. This wasn't just a victory, it was an incredibly profitable military transaction. It proved the viability of an emerging doctrine-denial warfare. The idea isn't that you have to occupy territory or destroy an enemy's entire army. Instead, you just have to make the cost of a specific military action for your enemy unacceptably high. Ukraine didn't need to build a massive fleet to control the Black Sea. They just needed to prove that any Russian attempt to land troops through that corridor would be a suicide mission. By spending $2 million, they effectively neutralized a strategic threat that would have cost billions to defend against conventionally. A retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Grady summed up the lesson perfectly. This is no longer about how big your gun island. It's about when you pull the trigger, and more importantly, who is watching the target for you before you do. The Black Sea grew quiet again, but the ripples from that ambush continued to spread, reshaping how the world thinks about war. A new doctrine had been written, not in ink, but in fire and water. When we step back and look at the entire picture, the story of the Black Sea ambush ceases to be just a chapter in the Russo-Ukrainian War. It becomes a prophecy, a glimpse into the future of global conflict. It asks a fundamental and unsettling question. What happens when intelligence truly becomes more dangerous than firepower? Throughout the 20th century, the paradigm of war was defined by industrial might. The nation that could produce the most tanks, planes, and ships would usually win. Military power could be measured physically by the tonnage of steel, the explosive yield of ordnance, the number of divisions on a map. Superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union spent trillions building these massive war machines. But the $30,000 PD-2 UAV became a ghost in that machine. It's a symbol of a profound paradigm shift. The revolution isn't the drone itself, it's the ecosystem around it. The real-time data networks, the rapid processing of information, and a flexible command structure that allows a general hundreds of miles away to make a split-second decision based on what that drone sees. This is the democratization of high-end military capabilities. It used to be that real-time intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance ISR over a wide area was the exclusive domain of superpowers, with their billion-dollar satellite constellations and spy planes. Now, a smaller nation with a modest defense budget can achieve a significant portion of that capability using off-the-shelf commercial technology and a bit of ingenuity. What does this mean for a superpower like the United States? The U.S. military has $13 billion aircraft carriers, $2 billion stealth bombers, and the most advanced weapon systems ever created. But the Black Sea ambush raises an uncomfortable question. Could a small group of clever adversaries armed with hundreds of cheap networked AI-driven drones effectively neutralize an expensive carrier strike group? It forces Pentagon planners to rethink the balance between quality and quantity, between expensive, exquisite platforms and cheap, expendable but numerous systems. Does the future belong to autonomous drone swarms that can simply overwhelm an enemy's defenses with sheer numbers? This confrontation is also a cautionary tale about the danger of technological complacency. Russia, a nation considered to have world-class electronic warfare capabilities, was outsmarted by the relatively simple tactic of using thermal layers and burst transmissions. It shows that in the military tech race, there is no finish line. Innovation must be constant. The moment you stop learning, you fall behind and become the prey. Ultimately, this story forces us to confront the reality that the human mind remains the ultimate weapon on the battlefield. Technology, no matter how advanced, is only a tool. The Ukrainian victory didn't come from the silicon chip in the UAV or the warhead in the Neptune missile. It came from the mind of General Vashchenko and his staff. It came from the ability to see a trap where others saw a river channel. It came from the patience to wait for the perfect moment instead of acting on instinct. It came from the wisdom to understand that sometimes doing nothing is the most decisive action of all. In a world increasingly obsessed with artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, the Black Sea ambush is a powerful reminder that human intelligence, creativity, audacity, and the ability to outthink an opponent are still the ultimate arbiters. The machines of war will change. Tanks may be replaced by drones, and fighter jets may give way to hypersonic missiles. But the ghost in the machine, the spark of human tactical genius, will forever be the deciding factor between victory and defeat, between life and death. And that is the most profound lesson from One Dark Night on an Even Darker Sea.